So this is all about coercive diplomacy in terms of his already rhetorical deployment of nuclear weapons, and then it may of course move into the actual kinetic act of coercion. And we should never think that Putin isn't contemplating this.
That's the voice of Dr. Fiona Hill, Senior Fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts Tom Queen and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. I hope that everyone had a very restful holiday weekend, whether or not you celebrate or live in the U.S. It was certainly time to take a moment and reflect on the past month of events. But hi, Tom. How are you doing? How was your weekend?
Hey, Lauren. Great to see you as always. I had a terrific weekend. I'm still trying to get my head back around work. It's nice to have 3 days to think about other things, and I really did try not to think about work too much. I got some exercise, I ate some good food, spent time with family. It was really nice. I'm up here in New Hampshire where you can do things like buy fireworks and launch them. So we did that for July 4th. You know, I have a mixed feeling about fireworks. They're dangerous, so people need to be careful with them. But at the same time, if you handle them carefully, they can be a lot of fun. And I'm always struck by how impressive and loud and dramatic the fireworks are that you can buy on the road for $20. I mean, they're quite dramatic, but at the same time, they're not for everyone. So please be careful when you use them. But we had a fun time.
Well, it sounds like a ton of fun, and I'm with you. After the 3-day weekend, getting back into work mode can be quite the challenge. So I'm very grateful to start this week off with you, Tom. So thanks for that wonderful description of your fireworks, and I'm glad that yours were all safe and fun. But what news do you have for us on the nuclear front?
We had a moment of hope last week on the Iran deal, but now once again, things are not looking good. Unfortunately, after a 3-month pause, the European Union hosted another round of indirect talks to return to the Iran nuclear deal, this time in Doha. And while both Iran and the U.S. continue to say that they want to see a return to the deal, negotiations failed to result in any progress. The Biden administration is pointing its finger at Iran and saying that the onus is on them to decide if they really want to come back into the deal. Rob Malley, the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, called the negotiations a wasted occasion, but Iran says that it wants to keep talking. You know, in my view, neither side really wants the deal bad enough to pay the price that the other is asking. And at the same time, neither side wants the talks to collapse. So we just kind of drift. But the delay hurts the United States more than Iran because Iran continues to make progress on its nuclear program and limit inspections by international inspectors. And at the same time, the outcome of the November elections here could make the prospects for the deal worse. So time is not on our side, yet the Biden administration is not pushing as hard as it should. Meanwhile, President Biden concluded his trip to Europe, where he participated in the G7 meeting in Germany and a NATO summit in Spain. These meetings focused largely on the war in Ukraine and were meant to demonstrate a united front against Russia. And the big news out of NATO is that Turkey has now said that it will back Sweden and Finland's bid for NATO membership. And so now it looks like the way is clear for Sweden and Finland to join NATO. Lauren, with that, what's the outlook for early warning?
For early warning, I sat down with Emma Claire Foley to discuss her new report, The Real Cost of ICBMs, U.S. Economic Development Beyond Defense Spending. She takes us through her research and the pathways for moving away from these dangerous weapons towards a more secure future. It's a great interview, so I can't wait for you to hear it.
And then we air a discussion between Ploughshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher and Dr. Fiona Hill from our annual gala chain reaction that took place in June. They discussed the Ukraine war in the context of President Putin's nuclear threats. It is also a great conversation, so please stay tuned. And if you want to see the video of the full interview, you can watch it at our website, ploughshares.org.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now,
early warning,
early warning,
early warning, early warning.
a 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. In the U.S., education, infrastructure, healthcare, and environmental health are harmfully underfunded. Meanwhile, defense spending continues to increase, and comprehensive human security is declining. Today, we're joined by Emma Claire Foley, the author of the new report, The Real Cost of ICBMs, U.S. Economic Development Beyond Defense Spending, which takes a critical look at the spending priorities of nuclear-armed states, including the United States. Emma Claire, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
First of all, congratulations on this report. Can you tell our listeners who maybe haven't read it yet about the scope and findings of your research?
Thank you. And yeah, absolutely. So the report tries to do two things. First of all, it evaluates claims made by the defense industry, by the U.S. military, and by local and state governments in the states where ICBMs are based. That's Colorado, Nebraska, North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming, as to the actual economic impact and employment impact of the U.S. Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force and the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, or GBSD program, which will modernize, actually means replace, all of these missiles to the tune of around $300 billion. So what I found, basically, is that there's very little accurate information about the economic impact of these programs, and very little accurate information as well about how many jobs they create. Nevertheless, we hear a ton of messaging from Northrop Grumman, who holds the GBSD contract, from all sides, from many different parties who have an interest in these programs, that this is an irreplaceable job creator for these states. However, we have research, especially from Brown's Cost of War project, showing that defense, compared to industries like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and non-fossil fuel energy, is a relatively poor job creator. And in fact, all of these other industries, which are urgently needed in those states to expand those workforces and those resources for people, all create more jobs. So the implications of the report, as I see them, are that communities on the ground in the ICBM states have a choice. So they can choose to continue to rely on defense spending, as they've been sort of obligated to since the early 1960s when the ICBM force was introduced, as a source of economic prosperity with an expiration date, although one that has recently been pushed a little bit further into the future with the GBSD program. Or, and this is what I hope to see, a movement across the country, not only within these states, but with everyone who understands, the threat of nuclear weapons and their relative uselessness as an economic development program, to push for better alternatives and to push for real community support for the communities at the front lines of U.S. ICBM force.
The U.S. defense budget continues to grow, and this year is the largest that we've ever seen it. Can you tell us what's causing this increase and the consequences of this upward trend?
I think a lot of people watching this process are asking that very same question, and that includes me. We're hearing a lot that the push to move the top line number ever closer to $900 billion, which is almost unthinkable, and the Senate markup recently that we've seen is over $100 billion more than the last Trump NDAA, which is amazing to me, especially given the messaging from the Biden campaign during his presidential run on the need to reduce especially the role of nuclear weapons. But we're hearing that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and inflation are both major pressures pushing that number up, even though we do have clear research that shows that the defense industry and that the Pentagon experiences inflation in a much different and more limited way than the average consumer, and has already planned for inflation in the calculations that went into the initial budget request. Another objection, obviously, is that the Ukraine spending is not part of that top line number. That is a separate process. And so arguments that it should push that number up don't hold too much water, even if you're looking at the argument about U.S. readiness, right, that now we must take this much more aggressive posture in response to Russia's aggression. So all of that is to say, I think we're in a difficult situation, certainly, globally, in terms of all these pressures that I've mentioned, economic and political, but it seems that, once again, the U.S. is trying to deal with problems that are not necessarily military in nature by simply pouring more money into its military establishment.
What can be done to address the consequences of those pressures and that increased funding and to fix this expensive problem?
I think that there have been many compelling arguments for how to bring that number down, many of which have been made before this budget process and continue to be just as relevant. There's extremely well documented cases of waste in terms of where that money from the budget is actually going. So that's one way to bring the number down. There is a really promising legislative initiative too in Congress now to bring the top line of the 2023 NDAA down by $100 billion. It's being championed by Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan, I believe. So there's different levers by which we could do this, right? But overall, the underlying problem, and the one that I tried to address in the report, is the lack of funding and the simple lack of concern at the highest levels of government for what actually constitutes human security, right? So we're seeing multiple really severe crises across America, and also just really clear consequences for the actual security of the United States and its people, its ability to actually, meet the threats that it really is facing and handle them effectively. And so increasing domestic spending in some of the areas I've mentioned and others that, may come to mind as well, I think would be really intuitive, basic first step to actually increasing the security of the United States.
This report is a wonderful tool to see the intersections that nuclear policy has with domestic policy. Where can listeners read your report?
Thank you so much for asking. If you would like to read the report, you can go to globalzero.org, that's globalzero.org, and click on the real cost of ICBMs. Or you can find me on Twitter at Emma Claire Foley, where I will surely be talking about this for many months to come.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your time with me today and for all the important work that you do, Emma Claire.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Ploughshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Ploughshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to ploughshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
This week, we're bringing you a conversation between Ploughshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher and Dr. Fiona Hill on the war in Ukraine and Putin's nuclear threats. This interview took place in June, and you may have caught some of it at Ploughshares Fund Annual Gala, Chain Reaction. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
To discuss the effects of Putin's nuclear threats and the implication of this war on nuclear policy, I'm joined today by Dr. Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow in the Centre on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. She served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia from 2006 to 2009, and Senior Director for Europe and Russia at the National Security Council from 2017 through 2019. She is the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, and co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Fiona, thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Emma. It's great to be with you.
And so you closely studied Russia, but you've also closely studied Putin himself. Can you give us some insight into him and how do we understand him in the context of Russia's history?
I have to say that, even though we had the INF treaty that was signed in 1987, it was clear that arms control had not come to an end and that there was still plenty to be done, and also that the Soviet Union itself was in transition. And Putin is a product of this. And so I started at the Brookings Institution, firstly as an adjunct fellow in 2000, the very year that Putin emerges on the scene. And he's obviously a whole different category of Russian president, even than before. Although, by this point we'd had Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, who had been reformists from within the Communist Party. Putin wasn't from the Communist Party. He was from the literal deep state, from the dark corridors of power, having risen up through the security services and the KGB. And it was the very first time that anyone had been selected as the leader of a country anywhere at all, who came from this kind of background from the security services. I mean, in the United States, George H.W. Bush had been the head of the CIA, but he was a politician. This is somebody who's come from the services as an operative, who has emerged and been selected. And it really showed that this was the re-emergence of the security state in Russia, although the jury was out for some period of time on Putin and where he was going to take things. But there was also a feeling that Russia's transition was taking a very different turn. And so I, along with my colleague Clifford Gaddy, who I worked together with on the book about Putin that you referenced earlier, we started to pay very close attention to Putin in the context of these changes inside of Russia, looking at the transition from the Soviet period, the things that were causing the whole transition to go awry politically and economically. And we had a feeling that the whole system was on a very difficult trajectory at this particular point. I don't think we could have envisaged where we would be now, but certainly there was a feeling that things were changing and we should be paying very close attention to this person, Vladimir Putin, because he was representative of a larger body of people you might call the higher police. Cliff Gaddy, my colleague, and others had written and studied the higher police, this kind of echelon within the security services, within the KGB, who saw themselves as the kind of elite and who were the, let's just put it this way, the cognoscenti of the system, the guys who really were kind of in charge of all of the intelligence. And they also saw themselves as having a role as defenders of the state and also of those of shaping ultimately some of the politics. And so I very much began, along with colleagues in a larger team at first, looking at Putin in this much larger context. I've followed him very closely for the whole period that he's been in the presidency and watched the twists and turns, not just in his whole tenure as head of the Russian state, either as president and prime minister and then president again, but the group of people around him and the influence that they've had in this much larger context of Russian political and cultural and socioeconomic history. I started off life as a historian when I first did my degrees, and Putin is a type who fits in very clearly into a much larger sweep of Russian history as well.
Thank you. And bringing that to where we are today, we're in a very delicate position, and Putin has really brought nuclear weapons into play in this conflict in an unprecedented manner, making both sort of veiled and overt threats of nuclear use. So while we want to do everything we can to help Ukraine and prevent him from using a nuclear weapon, presumably the international response could isolate Putin and push him into a corner in which potentially he contemplates nuclear use. Is that something that concerns you? And if so, how do we balance our conflict response and help Ukraine while not pushing Putin to the brink?
Look, there's always a risk with somebody like Putin that he will decide to use an instrument like a tactical nuclear weapon or even an intermediate nuclear weapon. Because as an operative, somebody who has been in the KGB and has been really pretty much versed in, let's just say, the dark political arts, he always wants to figure out if he can use a particular capability for the shock and awe effect, to intimidate people, to basically force them to do things that he would like them to do. This is all about coercive diplomacy in terms of his already rhetorical deployment of nuclear weapons. And then it may, of course, move into the actual kinetic act of coercion. And we should never think that Putin isn't contemplating this, because he's already weaponizing all of our fears about civilian nuclear accidents. But the very fact that we're in the early stages of the invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces were sent straight through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, irrespective of any kind of public outcry or even concerns about the health of those soldiers themselves, which there would be good reason to being. And of course, people like myself, of my age group, I'm 56 now, very clearly remember Chernobyl. I was a student in Scotland at the time in 1986, and we had to take iodine tablets for a period afterwards because we were thoroughly irradiated with the plume that came over, and Scottish farmers had to throw away the milk from their cows. Many of the sheep were contaminated and had to be slaughtered. So there were kind of knock-on effects, even, in fairly remote parts of Europe from this. And of course, just like we saw more recently with Fukushima and the horrific accident in the nuclear power station after the tsunami in Japan, there's always been a pretty visceral reaction to those kinds of accidents. And Putin deliberately stirred that up by sending the military there. So that has to be factored in as well. Then we also saw Russian forces, clearly on orders, shelling Zaporizhzhia, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, civilian nuclear power plant, again in Ukraine as part of the whole conflict. causing the IAEA to protest and want to send in an investigative team. And now the Russian military has seized control of Zaporizhzhia and is, in many respects, using this as nuclear blackmail again, especially on the power side, because they're actually saying to the Ukrainians that they won't produce the power from them, the Ukrainians will have to buy it. So there's all this whole complex of nuclear blackmail that Putin is already engaged in, even putting aside the whole very threatening issue and unprecedented issue, as you've put it very clearly there, of threatening to use a nuclear weapon. Now, Putin knows, of course, that there will be a very high threshold of response to this. But the rhetorical deployment he's trying to see right now is maybe sufficient to get some kind of response, because it's the very fact that we're all discussing this and that there is, then a lot of concern going back to the Euro missile crisis atmosphere in Europe, this whole intent. In fact, when I was in the National Security Council, in one of the very last meetings that I sat in, between Putin and President Trump in Osaka at the G20 in Japan in 2019, Putin actually raised the very issue again of the Euro missile crisis, essentially threatening President Trump and Americans by extension about a return to that kind of atmosphere. Now, at that point, he was doing it in the context of the withdrawal from the INF Treaty. So it wasn't related to Ukraine, obviously, back in 2019, but it was very clear that Putin knew that in the 1980s, there were all kinds of knock-on effects from the Euro missile crisis, and many effects that could be used for propaganda purposes and also coercive purposes. And so he's hoping by returning all of us to a state of anxiety, very anxiety that caused me to study Russian in the very first place back in the 1980s, that he can get us to put pressure on the United States government, to then put pressure on Ukraine or onto Europeans, and likewise to put pressure onto Ukraine to get Ukraine to sue for peace, all without even using a nuclear weapon. So I think the administration has said very clearly that right now they don't see any preparation for the use of a nuclear weapon, but he's already using it rhetorically, and he's trying to see to what effect that can be.
Thinking about then, if Putin thinks he's able to keep the US and NATO out of direct military conflict in Ukraine, and thinking about the lesson that he maybe takes from that, how can we move from this moment now to one where there's potential for arms control between the US and Russia?
Well, we always have to hold that out, because that was indeed on the agenda prior to the invasion on February 24th. I mean, we all know that there were a series of talks. Wendy Sherman had already been engaging in these. President Biden, of course, had promised them in Geneva in his meeting in the prior year with Putin after the initial buildup of Russian forces around Ukraine. And we had an agenda of meetings within the rubric of the ongoing strategic stability talks to try to move towards something that would be more comprehensive in terms of arms control and, perhaps further down the line of further arms reduction. We were planning on talking about what would replace INF, whether it was possible to have some kind of larger comprehensive discussion. The administration had already extended the New START treaty, and the whole plan was to figure out how to discuss the range of tactical, intermediate and long-range nuclear missiles, and also at some point to figure out how to talk about conventional weaponry as well. Because, of course, the Russians rely very heavily, not just rhetorically, but on the whole idea of the use of the nuclear arsenal because of discrepancies in their conventional warfare capabilities. And of course, we're seeing some of those playing out right now in the invasion of Ukraine, where the Russian military has not performed as well as it obviously anticipated to do. And that does run the risk that you raised earlier, that Putin feels if he's in a corner conventionally, that might be the moment that he may decide to make some further resort to not just nuclear saber rattling, but to think about, one way that he might be able to use this. And again, he always does things in a somewhat unexpected way. Again, think the use of Novichok and the use of polonium. There are all kinds of things and ways in which Putin can, escalate this situation for us. But we have to make it very clear that we are open and will continue to be open to this full range of discussion. But once the hostilities in Ukraine have ceased, and Russian forces are pulled out of Ukraine. I mean, we know that the Russians wanted to have these discussions. There's no question about it, but I do think we see from the whole the situation here, what might look like a pattern break in terms of the full-on invasion of Ukraine, that Putin prioritizes Ukraine and the subjugation of Ukraine right now much higher than the arms control discussions with the United States. And actually, we learned that previously. In 2018 and 19, there'd been a whole host of planning 4 arms control discussions between the Trump administration and the Putin government. And each time the meetings were pushed off either by some assassination attempt or something else that the Russians had done, maybe in Syria, for example. But in the latter case, it was because of the incident in the Kerch Strait, where the Russian Navy seized a Ukrainian vessel and all of the sailors after actually bombing them from a helicopter, at least strafing them with artillery from a helicopter, and injuring several of the Ukrainian sailors. And we were scheduled to have basically this arms control meeting. It had been long planned. The Russians were very eager to have it, but they refused to let the Ukrainian vessel and the sailors go, even though they knew that that would lead to the complete disruption of the nuclear arms control discussions. But they were prepared basically to let those go in favour of continuing to press the issue of Ukraine.
Let me ask something slightly different now, which is as we see Sweden and Finland submit petitions to join NATO, how can we ensure that the lessons of this conflict is not one where small states believe they need nuclear weapons or even to be under a nuclear umbrella to be safe?
Well, I think that's a really good point, because what Putin is doing in terms of the saber rattling is, as I said, very similar to what Kim Jong-un is doing in North Korea, which is engaging in full-on nuclear blackmail. And it does lead to, I think, a lot of questions for most countries about, well, do I need a nuclear weapon or not? And indeed, this is actually one of the reasons why Finland in particular, but also Sweden, have decided to finally join NATO after standing aside for it for so long, because the whole nuclear balance has suddenly shifted. There was no sign whatsoever during the Soviet period, from the Finns' point of view, at least certainly not after the Euro missile crisis, that the late Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev and certainly kind of Russia for most of the last 3 decades was really contemplating any kind of use of nuclear weapons in any kind of offensive manner. But now everything has changed completely. It's the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, obviously, first and foremost, the violation of Geneva Conventions and all the human rights violations that we're seeing. It's also the fact that Russia's completely ruptured the European security architecture that was intended to keep peace, not manage conflict, but keep peace. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as NATO and other mechanisms that were there. But it's this nuclear saber rattling which I think has really got the Finns and the Swedes on edge, because they have a pretty robust conventional military capability. They're more than willing and able to defend themselves from any kind of conventional incursion, but certainly they cannot against any kind of nuclear use. And so this is one of the major factors of trying to join NATO, because that gives the protection of the nuclear umbrella, the NATO nuclear umbrella. And I mean, that in a way is a kind of a guarantee against needing to have your own individual country's nuclear arsenal. And of course, there's also the pooling of the nuclear resources of France and the UK, at least in theory, under that rubric of NATO as well. But I do still think that what Putin is doing really raises the risks of proliferation. And one of the things that we really need to be getting ahead of is the potential for proliferation from this kind of action and rhetoric by Putin. We were supposed to have the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review, coming up. I'm sure that's something that you and everybody else has been very much focused on, but it's looking, highly unlikely that we're going to be able to make any headway on this right now. And so many other countries are watching this extremely closely to, figure out, I think, their own strategic perspectives here.
And so this really leads into my final question, which is, what do you think the most important takeaway is for the nuclear policy community that's really working on trying to reduce risk here?
I think it's really getting ahead of it and, setting up a comprehensive approach, including engagement with all of the other global nuclear powers, but also with other countries that have been flirting with the idea of nuclear weapons, and trying to basically get some pushback against this really very evidently reckless and irresponsible rhetorical use of nuclear weapons that Putin has engaged in. I mean, it's not the first time either that he's done this recently. If we look back to the period when Putin unveiled the hypersonic missile development, he did this during one of his national addresses to the Russian parliament, and he had a simulation behind him on a giant screen of a nuclear strike. And the geographic area that the nuclear missiles were headed towards looked suspiciously like Florida. And of course, that was when President Trump was in power. And of course, everybody knows that he has his center of residence at Mar-a-Lago. And it certainly got President Trump's attention when Putin did this. But that was the whole point. And no, okay, Putin's got our attention. So let's get ahead of it. And let's focus on the ways now in which we can head this off as a larger problem. Let's start to focus on strengthening the NPT. And let's also try to get commitments for other nuclear powers that it will be impermissible for any kind of use of a nuclear weapon in this kind of conflict, or in any conflict, frankly. So I do think that we need to reinvigorate more of our nuclear diplomacy. And many of the networks that Ploughshares fund and support, I think, are already engaged in this. But we really have to, I think, join up all of the networks. And especially in an international frame, it's not just going to be sufficient about the US government under scrutiny on how they handle all of the nuclear policy, but how other governments do this as well.
Well, Dr. Fiona Hill, thank you so much. This was such an insightful interview, and I'm sure I've given everybody a lot to think about. Thanks very much for your time and expertise.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Emma. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based band 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.